Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Flagler Museum and to the Whitehall Lecture Series. My name is John Blades. I'm the director of the Flagler Museum, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here today. And I will also extend a welcome to those who've joined us online. All of our lectures are webcast live so that anyone in the world can join these lectures, anyone who has access to the internet, that is. And we have a number of people who've joined us via the internet for today's lectures. I want to thank the sponsors for the lecture series, Max and Victoria Dreyfus Foundation and the Palm Beach Post, for helping to make this lecture series possible. We're lucky today for our third lecture on the presidents of the Gilded Age, those presidents who get a little less attention than some others but ought to get more attention, to have with us today Kenneth Ackerman, who is an attorney working in Washington, D.C. He has served as legal counsel on two committees for the United States Senate. During the Clinton administration, he headed the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. He has held various legal positions in the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and that's his vocation. His avocation, apparently, is being a historian and author of many books that are related to this time period, including Gold Ring, Dark Horse, Boss Tweed, and a book on younger J. Edgar Hoover. In fact, if you've been coming to this lecture series for a few years, you probably recognize Kenneth Ackerman as a previous lecture here. He came to lecture on Boss Tweed a few years ago here at the museum. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ken Ackerman to the Whitehall Lecture Series.
Thank you, John, for the nice introduction. Thank all of you for coming out on a nice Sunday afternoon to be here in Henry Flagler's beautiful home. That is not Boss Tweed. That's probably about as opposite of Boss Tweed as you'll ever see. The gentleman on the screen is James A. Garfield, and I'm very honored to be part of this series of Presidents of the Gilded Age. My job today is a kind of a difficult one. My job is to convince you that James A. Garfield is one of the most interesting and important presidents that nobody knows anything about. James Garfield, there's a certain disconnect about James Garfield that goes to the heart of the case I'm going to try to make to you. James Garfield served as president from 1881 until 1881. He was he was inaugurated on March 4th. He was shot in the back on July 2nd, and he died on September 19th, all of that one year, 1881. By the time he died, however, even after that short period of time, he was considered one of the most well-respected, beloved, and important people of his generation. More than 100,000 people came out to Washington, D.C. to see his body laying in state in the Capitol building in Washington. Over 150,000 people came to Cleveland, Ohio to see to his funeral a few days later. There were crowds along the railway lines all the ways out west. The nation was bereft for weeks after the passing of James Garfield. Every town and village in America that was around at that time has a Garfield Street, a Garfield Road, a Garfield Park, a Garfield High School, or something in memory of the president because he was so popular. Today, however, Garfield is almost completely forgotten, and he's one of the least known presidents. If you go onto Google and do a search of Garfield, you'll find way more hits for the cartoon cat than you will for the former president. Even though he's one of the four presidents who was assassinated, even that doesn't help to conjure him up. We tend to remember the other presidents who were assassinated. Abraham Lincoln, shot in 1865 by John Wilkes Booth. John Kennedy, shot in 1963 by Lee Harvey Oswald, and that guy on the grassy knoll who they never caught. Just seeing if you're aware. William McKinley, shot in 1901 by Leon Zalgos. Garfield is usually the other guy, the one who you can't quite remember, the other one who was assassinated. Part of it is that, yes, he served during that period of the Gilded Age, after the Civil War, before Theodore Roosevelt. It was a very important period in our history, but we generally remember it by the non-politicians. We remember the cowboys, we remember the immigrants, the robber barons, we remember Henry Flagler and Nelson and John Rockefeller. The politicians and presidents, though, we generally write off as a group of mediocrities and tend to put them in a back burner. As a result, Garfield is remembered for a lot of trivialities. He was the first left-handed president. He was the last president born in a log cabin. He was raised in poverty in the Western Reserve in Ohio, in the Cleveland area, back when that was unsettled. He was the first college professor to become president of the United States. He taught himself and became a professor at Hiram College in Ohio, and later became the college president. He was the fourth president from Ohio. There would be 8 of them altogether, tied with Virginia, though there's some double counting in that. He was the last president and the 5th president to be named James. Even Jimmy Carter seemed to get the memo on that one. He was the first and only president elected directly from the House of Representatives, though Dennis Kucinich gave it a good try the last time out. And he was the 3rd Civil War general to be elected president. He served in the early days of the war. He was a volunteer from Ohio. He rose through the ranks, and he became breveted as a general at the Battle of Chickamauga. For those of you who are familiar with Chickamauga, it was not a good day for the Union Army in general, but that was Garfield's most important battle. All of this doesn't really amount to very much. In most rankings of the presidents, every couple of years, C-SPAN or some other organization will put together some historians to rank the presidents. I've had the honor of being involved with that a couple of times. Garfield usually ends up right around the middle. There were some good things that happened during those 4 months. There were some bad things that happened. But mostly he's remembered for the unknowns, the potentials, the things that didn't happen, the fact that his opportunity was cut short so quickly. At the heart of this disconnect, why this very popular, beloved person at the time is so forgotten, really is the core event of his term, the assassination, what was behind it, why someone thought to shoot Garfield in the back 4 months into his term. We tend to dismiss the Garfield assassination and forget it because it too has been taken over by a stereotype. Something of a triviality, and that's what I'm going to try to bust for you during the rest of this talk. So, let me stay on Garfield. To understand the Garfield assassination, I have to tell you a little bit about the man as of 1880, the year before James Garfield became president. If you are James Garfield in 1880, you are a very lucky person. You're that man over there on the screen. Very handsome, nice beard. You're 48 years old and healthy, not a small matter in 1880. Garfield was about 6 feet tall, weighed about 200 pounds, in very good physical shape. Garfield was fortunate enough in life to be married to this woman. This is Lucretia Rudolph Garfield, his wife of 22 years. She was a much better wife to him than he was a husband to her. During the first 5 years of their marriage, they lived together about 6 months. He spent the rest of that time off giving speeches, off running for Congress, off fighting the Civil War, off being a national figure, while he left her at home in backwoods Ohio to raise their screaming little kids. She did not take to that terribly well, especially given the fact that he cheated on her a number of times. Not that unusual in the Gilded Age, however, he was caught. At least once, with a woman in New York who's only identified as a Ms. Calhoun. We don't know much about her beyond that. Lucretia found out about it. It was a big crisis in their marriage. They almost split up. But to both of their credit, they stuck it out and the wound healed. James Garfield built a house in Washington, brought her to town, and over the years they became extremely close. There are hundreds of letters that they wrote back and forth to each other, very open and affectionate, and they had one of the better marriages of that period. He had 5 children, all of them smart and healthy. None of them died in childhood, again, a rarity for that era. They acted like they enjoyed their parents' company. The 2 little ones are Abram and Irvin. The 3 ones standing up are James and Harry and Molly. The older woman standing at the side here is Eliza, James's mother, who was around 80 years old at the time. James Garfield loved his job in 1880. He had been a member of the United States Congress for 16 years. He was a very outgoing, friendly person, and he had lots of friends. His colleagues had made him the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, the chairman of the Banking Committee. They elected him the leader of the party. He was involved in all the interesting issues of the day and got to meet all the interesting people of the day. He was someone who loved Washington, where he lived most of the time. His diary shows that that summer of 1880, there were at least 5 days when he skipped out of congressional sessions to go and watch professional baseball on the Mall. He loved going to the theater. The big show that summer at Ford's Theater was HMS Pinafore by Gilbert and Sullivan, and Garfield loved the music. At his inauguration, he would end up having a German band come and play Pinafore songs all night long. He had a farm in Mentor, Ohio, that he and Lucretia spent their time when he was away at Washington, and it was a good time for the country. The economy was good. It was booming. It was a rich time. It was the height of the post-war industrial boom. The Wall Street crash of 1873, which had sent the country careening into depression, was largely over by 1880. Railroads were doing well. Mr. Flagler was doing very well in Ohio, earning the money that would ultimately allow him to build this very beautiful home here in Palm Beach, Florida. So it was a good time. But despite all of these very good things happening in his life, James Garfield had this itching thought in the back of his mind, like many politicians who've been in Washington a long time. Wouldn't it be nice to be President of the United States? Now, in 1880, James Garfield thought this, but he had never done anything about it. He had never campaigned for it. He had never asked anyone about it. He had never done any of the backroom things that you did back then if you wanted to organize a campaign. In fact, 1880 was an election year, and he had two good friends who were running for the Republican nomination, James G. Blaine and his colleague from Ohio, John Sherman. That summer, Garfield went to the nominating convention of his party, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute, not as a candidate, but as a campaign manager for John Sherman. And lo and behold, out of the blue, without asking for it, without lifting a finger, in fact, when his name first came up, he objected, the nomination fell in his lap. Suddenly, he became the nominee and the odds-on favorite to be President of the United States. A wonderful thing that happened in his life. However, at that moment, James Garfield would have been very cognizant of that old expression, be very careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. That wonderful thing that happened in his life would start a series of events that would lead to his morning in a Washington, D.C. train station. Skip over him for a moment. So this is a cartoon from Puck magazine, one of the great magazines of the 1880s, published in New York City, had the best artists at the time, the real followers of Thomas Nast. The man you see on the cover is Charles Guiteau. Charles Guiteau is the man who shot James Garfield, shot him in the back. It happened on July 2nd, 1881, at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. At 9:30 in the morning, James Garfield, the president, at this point, entered the train station arm in arm with James G. Blaine, at that point his Secretary of State. It was a Saturday morning. Garfield was in a very wonderful frame of mind. He was leaving for his summer vacation. He was going to meet his wife Lucretia in Philadelphia, and together the two of them with some friends were going to travel up to New York City, then travel around New England, and then after that visit their family in Ohio. There was no Secret Service protection for presidents in 1880. That would not start until the Grover Cleveland era in 1896. The Secret Service existed at this point, but it was more in the James West, Artemus Gordon period. In other words, there were Secret Service agents, but they were off capturing spies and counterfeiters, people like that. Guiteau had been following Garfield around for weeks, waiting for an opportunity to remove him from office, as he put it. He knew that Garfield was going to be out of town for a few weeks, so this was the moment he had to make work. If you look at the gun, right there in his right hand, if this pointer is working okay for everyone, it says English Bulldog. That's the gun that he used to shoot the president. Essentially, when Garfield walked into the lobby, Guiteau had been waiting for him. He stepped out from where he had been waiting, stood behind the president, picked up the gun, and fired 2 shots. The first shot hit Garfield in the arm. It grazed him and then went off and didn't do any damage. The second bullet hit Garfield flat in the back. That's the one that knocked him down and ultimately did him in. Ever since that time, there's been a story about the assassination, and it started very much with this cartoon. You see that sign that Guiteau is holding in his hand, an office or your life. We generally think about, when we think about the Garfield assassination at all, the way people generally sum it up was that he was killed by a disappointed office seeker who was trying to get a federal job. He didn't get it. He got mad at the president, so he hunted down the president and shot him. Well, there is something to that story. Charles Guiteau was 39 years old when he shot the president in 1881. He was born in Freeport, Illinois. He had a tough childhood, but who didn't? His mother died when he was very young. His father was a strict Huguenot, a follower of the philosopher John Humphrey Noyes. If that name doesn't ring a bell, Noyes was the one who created the Oneida community. The Oneida community was one of a series of utopian socialist communes, essentially, in the country during the 1850s. They believed in free love, shared labor, and mutual criticism. Charles Guiteau, as a young man, actually went to the Oneida community for about a year and lived there. It didn't work out very well. He apparently didn't get any of the free love, and he got way more than his share of the mutual criticism. His nickname among the women there was Charles Get Out. He left and he sued them. Didn't go very well. After that, he became a lawyer, a bill collector, a preacher, an insurance salesman. None of them worked out too well. He was married and divorced. He beat his wife. In 1880, however, he got an idea. At around the time that James Garfield was nominated for president, Guiteau thought, well, maybe I ought to go and join the campaign and do campaign work like any other political volunteer. And maybe if that worked out, I'd be able to get a job in the government. That's always solid. I could be a political appointee with a patronage job. So Guiteau came to New York City. New York City is where the important major campaign committees were housed. New York State was by far the biggest state electorally, and elections were run on a state-by-state basis. He went to the campaign headquarters. He got to know the people there. He hung around there every day. He gave 2 or 3 speeches for the campaign for the Garfield ticket. And when Garfield won, Guiteau decided that he, like everyone else in the office, deserved a political appointment in the government. He did his homework, and he picked a very good one. He decided he wanted to be consul, head of the American consulate in Paris, France. He didn't speak French. He had never been outside of the country. But frankly, then as now, qualifications aren't what got you political appointments. He felt that having done some campaign work, that would give him some cachet to at least have a good run at the money. So after the inauguration, Guiteau came to Washington. He pestered everyone. He came to the White House, stood online with all the hundreds of other office seekers. He went to the State Department and stood online with the office seekers there. He sought out the major Republican senators and campaign leaders and to get recommendations. He tried this. He worked at it. But after a couple of months, it didn't work out. Finally, James Blaine, the Secretary of State, told him in no uncertain terms that he was not going to get the job. About 2 weeks later, Guiteau followed Garfield to the train station and shot him. After Garfield died in 1883, Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which turned out to be one of the most important and successful reforms of that era. Within 10 years, 86,000 federal employees were placed under the merit system. That's about 90% of the total. The Civil Service Commission attracted some of the most talented people of that era, including young Theodore Roosevelt. If that's all there was to the story, a disappointed office seeker kills the president, results in a major change in civil service rules, that would be a pretty nice story. But there's a problem with it. And the problem is that it's basically not true. You see this sign, an office or your life. Well, it turns out that Guiteau did make a statement when he shot the president, but that wasn't it. In fact, it was nothing like that. Here's what happened. we go back to the train station that morning. After Guiteau shot the president, he took the gun, it's still in his hand, English bulldog, he put it down at his side and tried to quietly walk out of the room. It didn't work too well because a lot of people saw him shoot the president. They started shouting, "Here he goes, don't let him go." A couple of big policemen stopped him at the door. They roughed him up a little bit. Then they started dragging him away to a local police station so that they could get him away from the crowd before anyone hurt Guiteau. As they were leading him away, Guiteau said very clearly the following: "I did it. I will go to jail for it. I am a stalwart, and Arthur will be president." That's what Guiteau did say. "I am a stalwart, and Arthur will be president." And just to make sure that nobody misunderstood what he was saying, the night before the assassination, Guiteau wrote several letters and planted them in his jacket pocket for the police to find, and he also left a letter for the newspapermen to find at a newspaper office saying the exact same thing. "I am a stalwart, Arthur will be president." So what's that all about? Well, if there's any president from the Gilded Age who's even more obscure than James Garfield, it's this gentleman right here. This is Chester Alan Arthur. Arthur was the vice president in 1881, elected on the ticket with Garfield. So if you shoot Garfield, you get Arthur. Now, Arthur had a certain reputation of his own in 1881. For most people, it wasn't a real good one. He was known as the gentleman boss. He was from New York City. He was 56 years old at the time. But the nickname gentleman boss was a half-truth as well. Gentleman, certainly. As you could tell by the picture, Arthur was a very well-groomed, well-dressed man. He was the kind of person who would try on literally 20 pairs of pants every morning before picking the one he wanted to wear. He had a very big account at Brooks Brothers in New York City. He dressed very well. He had a very nice brownstone on Lexington Avenue. He was a very sentimental man. His wife, Ellen Herndon, had died the winter before he was nominated for vice president. He cut fresh flowers every day and put them at a picture of her that he kept on his fireplace. He was a very friendly, outgoing person. He was very comfortable going out with the city elite. He was very comfortable going to a local saloon with the local workers or the local campaign workers in the neighborhood. He was an ardent abolitionist early in his life. Arthur, as a young lawyer in the 1850s, brought a case in New York that won for free African Americans the right to ride on public streetcars in New York City. Very similar to the Rosa Parks case down south in the 1950s. Chester Alan Arthur brought that case in New York City in the 1850s. He was a quartermaster general in the Civil War and very much a gentleman, a gentleman's gentleman. However, as far as being a boss, that one didn't quite fit. There was a boss in New York State who ran the political machine in New York State, but it wasn't him, it was him. This is Roscoe Conkling. Roscoe Conkling in 1880 was the longtime senator from New York. He was the leading senator. There was no formal majority leader of the Senate back at that time, but Roscoe Conkling was the leading personality of the Senate. A very charismatic figure, a very hard-edged figure. Conkling was the boss. He was the one who made all the decisions. He decided who would get elected, who would get nominated, who would get what position, who would get patronage, what position they would take on public issues. Within the structure of the New York political machine, Republican political machine, Conkling was the chief executive officer, Arthur was the chief operating officer. Arthur's job in 1880 was chairman of the New York Republican State Committee. His entire adult life, Arthur had been a protege of Roscoe Conkling. It was Conkling who got him all of his jobs, including his job as vice president. Arthur had had national exposure only once before becoming vice president, and it wasn't very good. In the mid-1870s, Roscoe Conkling had convinced President Grant, who you know about from your lecture last week, to appoint him to a very important federal post, the collector of the Port of New York. Now, at the point in 1880, there was no income tax in America. The government ran on import tariffs. And 90% of the imports into the country came through New York. So the New York Custom House was the most important financial arm of the United States government. It also employed about 300 or 400 people, all of whom were political appointees appointed by Arthur, cleared by Roscoe Conkling, which made it also one of the most important political jobs in the country, widely considered more important than a cabinet post, and it actually paid a larger salary than the presidency. When Rutherford Hayes became president, he was a believer in civil service reform. He fired Chester Alan Arthur on the charge that Arthur tolerated corruption in the Custom House. This caused a big blow-up. Roscoe Conkling was furious. He fought Hayes tooth and nail over this. It resulted in one of Roscoe Conkling's better outbursts. Talking about the Snivel service effort, he said, "When Dr. Johnson said that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel, it's only because he didn't know the many uses of the word reform." Conkling would fail. Arthur would lose his job. He would go back to being the chairman of the party in New York State, and then the vice president as Conkling's representative. Arthur, in fact, ran the 1880 campaign in New York as chairman of the state committee. When Charles Guiteau, the guy with the gun, came to New York to work on the campaign, the committee office he went to was Chester Alan Arthur's office. While hanging around with the other volunteers, he met Arthur maybe half a dozen times. Now, always it was in passing. Arthur was the executive, and as any of you involved in politics know, when you're running a campaign, you're always very polite to the campaign volunteers. You always make a point to shake their hands, to pat them on the shoulders, to tell them what a good job they're doing. And even in 1880, Arthur was no different. To him, it was simply a matter of being polite. But to Charles Guiteau, it meant quite a lot. He considered Arthur a good friend, whether Arthur returned that or not. And by July 1881, when he shot the president, Garfield and Conkling and Arthur had been fighting over patronage for months. As a result, when Guiteau shot the president and said, "I am a stalwart, Arthur will be president," most people in America knew exactly what that meant. That morning after the shooting, Chester Alan Arthur and Roscoe Conkling arrived in New York City from a trip to Albany. They went to the Fifth Avenue Hotel, and they were met by death threats. They needed armed police escorts to go out on the streets because there were so many suspicions that they might have been involved in the assassination. Even the New York Times said around that time that there was less circumstantial evidence to hang Mary Surratt in the Lincoln conspiracy than there is connecting Conkling and Arthur to the Garfield shooting. So how did James Garfield, this nice man from Ohio, managed to get himself so on the wrong side of the New York political machine that someone would want to shoot him over it? Well, for that, I need to walk you through one of the great political moments of the 1800s, the 1880 Republican Convention in Chicago. Now, here is a cartoon, again from my favorite Puck magazine, that shows the outcome of the 1880 convention. I need to give you a quick word about politics in the 1800s. They are very different than what we know today. Today, when you think of a national political convention, it's usually a very staid affair, a very dull affair. Our presidential candidates, as we know very laboriously from last year, win the nomination by running in primaries and running as caucuses for months leading up to the convention. By the time you get to the convention, the voters have spoken. That's democracy as it should be. We know who the delegates are, we know who they're committed to, we know who's going to win. And the convention itself is more like an extended television infomercial about the candidate. Back in the 1800s, it was totally different. There were no primaries, there were no caucuses generally. The delegates were picked by the local party strongmen, sometimes by a local party convention, and the national convention is where the different factions came to have it out. As a result, political conventions in the 1800s could be very explosive, very passionate affairs, very unpredictable, bare-knuckled fights. They could be driven by a backroom deal or by a good speech, and often they were. They could often run into dozens One convention ran into over 100 ballots as the different factions had it out. The 1880 one was a very special one. It drew the largest crowd ever up to that time. Some 50,000 people came to Chicago in 1880 for the Republican Convention. A gallery pass to watch the convention cost $25. That's almost $1,000 in 1880 money, just to see what was going on. It was heavily covered by telegraphs and newspapers. Part of the appeal, part of the reason was the political layout. It was a very exciting three-cornered race. One of the candidates was this man here. That's General Ulysses Grant. Back in the 1800s, by the way, if you could claim to be president and you could claim to be general, everyone called you general because they knew what was more important. General Grant in 1880 was still an extremely popular man. He was viewed as the hero of the Civil War, the man who defeated Robert E. Lee, a two-term president, great name recognition, a very wide following. He had left the White House in 1876 under a cloud of scandal. His second term did not go very well that way. There were the Credit Mobilier, the whiskey ring, the impeachment of his war secretary, and several other things. But by 1880, Grant had very much recovered his reputation. He traveled around the world in an unprecedented trip that was heavily covered by the newspapers. He was the first American president to be treated as an equal by Queen Victoria, by Chancellor Bismarck, by the Emperor of Japan. He was greeted by thousands of dock workers in Liverpool, England, as well as hundreds of thousands of peasants when he landed in China. He was considered a very good emblem for America around the world, and by the time he returned, about 6 months before the convention, he was very popular. Many people thought he would be a good, strong man in the White House. His campaign was managed and organized by a group of state political bosses who had been very powerful under the first Grant administration, less powerful under Rutherford Hayes, and thought they would be very powerful again if Grant returned to office. The way it was portrayed publicly was a little bit like this. Here you see a couple of bosses. Well, that's Grant in the middle being fed his porridge by Roscoe Conkling of New York. This gentleman here is John Logan. He was the political leader in Illinois, one of the other state bosses behind the Grant campaign. Here's another one from that time. Here you see Roscoe Conkling getting Grant drunk before the nomination. Yes, it's true, Grant did have a drinking problem in the 1850s. He fought it during the Civil War. By 1800, it was very much in the past, but still the stereotype struck. Grant came into the convention with about 300 votes, not enough to win, but more than anyone else. His chief rivals were these two gentlemen standing in the background. This is James Gillespie Blaine, this fellow here. You can't see him too well. But he was the leading opponent. He was another political boss. He was a senator from the state of Maine. He was somewhat of a reformer, not much of a reformer. He was against the civil service system, just like Conkling. He held many of the political views of Conkling. The main differences had to do with personality and power. But Blaine had about 290 delegates, and he was the main balance against Conkling. John Sherman was the Secretary of the Treasury under Rutherford Hayes, former senator from Ohio. James Garfield came to Chicago as one of the campaign managers for John Sherman. Now, I won't go into all the minutiae of the political convention. I do that a lot in my book. I find conventions fascinating in their own way because of all the internal dynamics. But basically what happened is this. For 34 ballots, the three sides held solid. For ballot after ballot after ballot after ballot over a day and a half, every time Grant would get 300 votes, give or take, Blaine would get 290, give or take, Sherman would get about 90, give or take. On the 34th ballot, however, the Blaine side broke first. Very late in the ballot, when they got to Wisconsin, W, right near the end, 16 delegates from Wisconsin broke to Garfield, out of the blue. Garfield, sitting there, was mortified. He was there representing John Sherman. He didn't want to appear to be disloyal. He wasn't prepared to become president. He was simply there for the show. He objected to the votes counting, but he was overruled. James Blaine, watching this back in Washington, D.C., following it by telegraph, saw what was going on, and he had a very good idea. He thought, well, if I'm not going to win, if my side is breaking first, I don't want Grant to win, but Garfield maybe I could live with, especially if I could take credit for giving him the nomination. That way Garfield would be in my debt. So Blaine sent a signal to his managers in Chicago saying, go ahead and tell my supporters to back Garfield and we'll get this over with. John Sherman, sitting in Washington, realized about the same thing and about the same time and sent the same signal to his supporters in Ohio as well, that if things start to fall apart, go for Garfield. Sure enough, on the 36th ballot, the floodgates broke. Garfield won in a stampede, and suddenly he was the nominee. The descriptions of Garfield at the time are almost comical. He's described as having a very pained expression on his face, not knowing what to do, telling people, no, don't vote for me, no, don't vote for me. But at that point, it was just too late. Everyone was not happy, however. The Grant supporters didn't like this at all. In fact, the 305 votes for Grant stuck till the end of the 36th ballot. And as you can see from the cartoon, here is General Grant surrendering. A very humiliating moment for the general of the army who defeated Robert E. Lee, to have lost to this nobody, James Garfield. And you can see the political bosses behind him. Here's Roscoe Conkling having to bow down to the ground. Roscoe Conkling was one of those people who didn't give an inch to anyone. Here's John Logan, and here are the others. They were in a very sour state of mind, and the Garfield side realized that if they were to have any chance of winning the election, they had to do something to win over the stalwarts, the stalwart bosses. And so they did two things. First, they reached out to Chester Alan Arthur, Conkling's protege, and offered him the vice presidency. Arthur said yes, and that's how you got the ticket. Then, a couple of weeks after the convention, Garfield traveled to New York City. He met with some of Conkling's friends, and although the meeting is somewhat mysterious, somewhat controversial, everyone seemed to walk out with an understanding that if the stalwarts agreed to campaign hard for the ticket, that Garfield promised them control over all the patronage in New York State. A very big concession. So with that all in place, the campaign was off to the races. It was the closest popular vote in American history. Garfield won by about 2,000 votes. That's way closer than Al Gore's margin over George Bush in 2000. The electoral vote was a little bit larger, but still very, very close. But the way it worked out, when Garfield finally became president, he owed his nomination to one boss, James Blaine. He owed his election to another boss, Roscoe Conkling, a very difficult position to be in. He was heavily in debt on all sides, and all sides very quickly came to collect. Now, if you're James Garfield at this point, you have to figure out what on earth you're going to do. How do you run your administration, let alone what kind of person are you going to be? What kind of president are you going to be? Are you going to let yourself be dominated by the bosses? At first, Garfield had not really realized what he had gotten himself into. He didn't recognize how badly he was being manipulated by the different sides. The first thing he did was he picked James Blaine as his Secretary of State. James Blaine at least was a friendly person. He did it in a nice way, even if he was very manipulative. Roscoe Conkling was a very arrogant, vitriolic, insulting person who spent a lot of time bickering, complaining about Garfield in the public press, about how he wasn't living up to the commitments he made, the pledges he made before the election. The key moment boiled down to the nomination for the collector of the Port of New York. Garfield nominated, here you see the campaign, notice Roscoe Conkling, the snake in the grass, during the election campaign, typical of the era. I'm going to go backwards on those two slides if you're trying to keep up. Garfield nominated for the collector of the Port of New York this man, William Robertson. William Robertson is totally forgotten to history. He has a very important cameo role in this drama. Robertson was a backer of James Blaine and an enemy of Roscoe Conkling. He sat in the New York State Senate. Blaine told Garfield to go nominate this man, with the idea that this would be Blaine's way of playing around with the Conkling machine in New York. Garfield nominated him without really understanding what he had gotten himself into, until Roscoe Conkling exploded. He was furious over this. Roscoe Conkling said that he would block every nomination that came out of the Garfield administration because of this. They tried to negotiate, but Conkling was extremely insulted and high-handed in the way he went about dealing with the president. Finally, Garfield recognized that if he were going to be able to control his own administration, he had to fight for William Robertson. Like it or not, whether it was a good nominee or not, he had to fight for it. Otherwise, he would be ditched around by political bosses for his entire term of office. He decided to withdraw every other nomination on Capitol Hill except for William Robertson. As a result, the Senate, then as now, did nothing for about 2 months. It was totally stalemated over this one fight. Garfield said, "It had better be known whether the president is the head of the government or the registering clerk of the Senate." He said, "Senators who dare to oppose me will henceforth require letters of introduction to the White House." In other words, they won't get invited to any of the parties. He said, "Robertson may be carried out of the Senate head first or feet first. I will never withdraw him." And there was a deeper issue that people recognized going on here. A remarkable cheapening of the politics of the country, totally mixed up, tangled in fights over political patronage and political power. That brings us back to this cartoon, another one from my favorite Puck, showing the Senate floor. The caption says, "This is not the New York Stock Exchange, it is the patronage exchange called the U.S. Senate." And you see right in front, here's Roscoe Conkling with his friend Chester Alan Arthur. Chester Alan Arthur, the vice president, publicly sided with Conkling against his own president in this fight over patronage. Finally, Garfield drew a strong line in the sand. He won. Conkling realized he would lose the vote, and so he withdrew. Conkling resigned from the Senate in a very dramatic huff of anger one day. You can see the cartoon calls it a harmless explosion. Once Conkling was out of the way, the Senate approved William Robertson in a couple of days. It was about 2 days after that, by happenstance, that Charles Guiteau, the man with the gun, went to the State Department and was told by James Blaine that he would not be consul to Paris, France. Now, Guiteau was following all of these events daily in the newspaper. He considered Chester Alan Arthur his friend. He considered himself part of the stalwart faction. He had spent all those days in New York at Arthur's office. And he saw himself as part of this larger drama being played out. One night that week, he woke up in the middle of the night with a cold sweat, with an epiphany. He thought, Garfield needs to be removed from office. It's not about me, but for the good of the party, for the good of the country, for the good of the stalwarts, Garfield must be removed from office. Guiteau went back to bed that night. He woke up the next morning, thought about it again, and he thought, this is such a good idea that me, Charles Guiteau, I'm not smart enough to think of this. It's such a good idea that it had to come from God, because only God could have thought of such a good idea. And so he decided that he had to carry out that will, and a few days later, he followed Garfield to the train station and shot him dead. The trial of Charles Guiteau for the murder of James Garfield was one of the great courtroom dramas of the 1800s. It lasted for 54 days. It was telegraphed daily all across the country. Some 90 witnesses were called for the prosecution, 50 for the defense. It covered almost 3,000 pages of transcript. Everyone in Washington at first wanted to go and watch. It was a great drama. There were two major issues that were raised by the defense. Guiteau defended himself with the help of two lawyers. One was causation. Yes, it's true that after Garfield was shot, the doctors examined him without washing their hands and without washing their instruments. In fact, the doctors, even by the standards of 1881, did a pretty rotten job. There were a lot of complaints, even by doctors at that time, of how they handled the president's treatment. Garfield ended up dying of infection and blood poisoning, not from the gunshot wound. If they had simply left him alone, cleaned the wound, fed him, and let him rest, he probably would have survived. However, as Guiteau put it, I only shot him, they killed him. It was a good try, but it didn't quite work at the time. The second issue was insanity, and this is one that reverberates to this day. Guiteau said he was not insane. In fact, he insisted he was not insane. But this was the hotly debated issue of the trial. The rule at the time was the Minautan rule. If you knew it, if you knew you did it, and you knew it was wrong, that was enough. That was the rule at the time. The modern medicine of psychology, the modern science of psychology didn't really exist yet. To this day, there's a debate over whether Guiteau was simply weak-willed or medically insane. In a way, it really doesn't matter, because even if he was insane, his insanity was informed and led by the environment surrounding him that made him think that the proper thing to do was to shoot the president. If anything, to me, the insanity issue was an excuse to wipe away the real causes of the Garfield assassination. Which brings us back to James Garfield. James Garfield survived for 79 days after being shot in the back by Charles Guiteau. During those 79 days, he showed remarkable grace under fire as he dealt with his wounds. The country hung on every medical bulletin coming out of the White House. He and Lucretia opened up their lives and their homes to the public in a much more intimate way than any other president had done up until that time. And so when he died, it wasn't surprising that he was a truly beloved figure in the country. Americans at the time understood the Garfield assassination. To people alive back then, as I mentioned, over 100,000 seeing his body in Washington, over 150,000 in Cleveland, they would be shocked that he is a forgotten man today, and I think we should be embarrassed that he is a forgotten man today. People understood why Garfield was shot in the back. He was someone who was respected for taking a principled stand against bosses, for the rights of the presidency, and against the cheapening of our political system. He was a person who confronted his problems in an honest and direct way and paid the price. He's someone who said at one point, "I am not a good hater." And he showed that you didn't have to be a good hater to be a good president and a good person either then or now. That is, to me, the true legacy of James Garfield. That's why I think he is one of the most important and interesting presidents that no one knows anything about. And I'm proud for this, and I'm honored to have this opportunity to present him to you today, 130 years later. Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions and comments, if anyone. Good.
So what was the consequence of all this for Arthur?
For Arthur? Hey, Arthur became president, and interesting you should ask. When Arthur became president, at first there was a lot of public suspicion about him. But during the 79 days after the shooting, he carried himself in a very dignified way, and he showed real remorse for what had happened. If anything, Arthur seemed to understand what he had done wrong. And when he became president, he recognized that he needed to heal the country. Within a couple of weeks of becoming president, Roscoe Conkling came to New York, met privately with Arthur, and demanded that he fire William Robertson and put some of the stalwart backers into high political jobs. Arthur basically told him to get the hell out of my office. And that resulted in a lifelong split between these two people who had been friends for so many years. The two of them never spoke to each other again. Conkling became a private lawyer in New York City, and worked against Arthur's renomination. Arthur, for his part, was a relatively good president for that era. He only lasted one term. His party refused to renominate him. The stalwarts felt that he had turned against them by not firing William Robertson. The Garfield types felt that Arthur had never been loyal in the first place. And so as a result, in 1884, the Republicans nominated James Gillespie Blaine. Arthur died shortly after leaving the White House of Bright's disease, which is a very painful form of kidney disease. But generally was thought of as a fairly good president, actually one of the most scandal-free presidencies of that era. Yes, sir?
Garfield was very socially advanced for his day. Do you think if he had lived, there would have been perhaps less institutionalization of the Jim Crow laws down south?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Garfield was... Oh, I'm sorry. The question was this. Garfield was actually very socially liberal for the time. He was had a strong abolitionist streak, a strong women's rights streak. The Republican Party was a very different animal in the late 1800s than it is today, on a number of different grounds. The economic grounds are somewhat different, but Garfield was very much a social liberal. And the question was, if he had lived with the Jim Crow laws, be different than today? And my feeling is that they very much would. You may recall in 1877, and you're going to hear more about this in your lecture in, I believe, next week or the week after, when you hear the fraud of the century about the Tilden Hayes affair. Hayes was elected in 1877 in a contested election. And a deal was struck at the very end where the southern states agreed to allow Hayes to be inaugurated, and in return, Tilden ended Reconstruction. Excuse me, Hayes ended Reconstruction by withdrawing federal troops from the southern states. Garfield was part of the group that came up with that compromise. And Garfield and Hayes both felt very much cheated by it, because as soon as federal troops came out, the Confederates, the post-Confederate South, the backers of the Lost Cause, began crushing the freed black slaves in the South, taking away their right to vote. There were a series of hangings. It was a very violent period, not only against freed blacks, but against white Republicans in the South. Garfield, if anything, after he had survived his fight with Conkling, and if he had survived the assassination, he's someone who would have had the public behind him in a very strong way. That, combined with Blaine's street smarts, could have put him in a very good position to do something about it if he had lived. Yes, sir?
Why did they take him out of Washington after he was shot that year?
The question is, why did they take James Garfield out of Washington that summer after he was shot? And the answer is this. They were treating James Garfield in the White House in August of 1881. Washington is a terrible place to be in August, even worse then than it is today. It was very hot, very humid, and at the time, Washington was not a very sanitary place. There were dirt roads. What today we think of as the Washington Mall, particularly the area around the Lincoln Monument, was pretty much an open sewer. The smells were very bad. There were outbreaks of disease over the summer. So they felt it would be much healthier for Garfield to be moved, even though he was in very delicate condition, to the New Jersey shore. So they put him on a special train and moved him in absolute silence from Washington to Elberon, New Jersey, near Long Branch. The story of his moving is a very moving story. Crowds lined the tracks all the ways from Washington up through New Jersey, and the crowds stayed absolutely silent. They were told not to disturb the president because the president is recuperating, and the crowds went along with it. When they finally got to the Jersey shore, the tracks ended about 100 yards short of where the house was. And so a group of men who were there at the last minute actually laid about 100 feet of railroad track so that they can move the special car right up to the door. So as a result, Garfield spent his last couple of weeks alive in a bed propped up, and here's a picture of it, in Elberon, New Jersey, where he could at least lie and see the seashore.
Okay, we have a question online.
Okay.
Did you uncover any information suggesting Conkling's camp may have encouraged the shooting?
Okay, the question is, did I uncover information that Conkling's camp may have encouraged the shooting? Not directly, There was no direct information. There was no direct there was direct communication, but more in the direct communication that existed was that Charles Guiteau was spending those months pestering senior senators, asking for their help in making him consul to Paris. But as far as Conkling and Arthur were concerned, they really didn't even know that the man existed. So there was no personal communication that way. As far as Arthur in any way being an accessory to the murder, there was no direct evidence. However, what they did was to create an atmosphere, an environment of political, partisan confrontation, where a person with a weak mental constitution, whether he crosses the line to be medically insane, or whether he was just a person seeking publicity, or however you describe it medically, that person would take it into his mind and draw the bottom line that it made sense to shoot the president. I see one about halfway back. Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead.
Oh,
yes.
You're a marvelous humorous actor. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
My question is about the cartoon with the tents at the convention.
Mm-hmm.
Were they for the delegates? That one, yeah. And what is the writing on the tents, please?
The writing on the tents, if you look at it closely, every one of them refers to one of the scandals. Postal frauds. So I can't read them from this angle, but every one of them refers to a scandal. And each of these people in front of the tents are a boss from one of the states. This is Roscoe Conkling, Blaine here at the end, John Logan, Don Cameron, and several others. So those were the stalwart bosses. They used tents basically to play on General Grant leading his army.
Oh, thanks.
There was a military allusion. Sir, and then behind you.
Two questions quickly. Guiteau, was he shot? Somebody said that I heard that he was shot when he was in jail.
There were. Go ahead.
And the other question was Arthur born in Vermont or Canada?
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one. Okay. First about Guiteau. Guiteau was hung, and he was hung in Washington D.C. However, there were 2 assassination attempts after the trial, between his trial and the hanging. Someone took a shot at his police wagon one day, and then someone took a shot at his jail cell one day. Neither of the shots were very good, and neither of the people were ever prosecuted. As far as Chester Alan Arthur, that's a very interesting question, and it's come up a lot because of the birther issue with President Obama. Because when this issue was in fact raised with Arthur, whether he was born in Canada or in Vermont, and the general feeling, it was investigated quite a lot. There was never anything dispositive one way or the other. He was born close to the border, but there was never any evidence that he was born in Canada. And the temper of the time was that you take someone at their word until you have a reason to show different. So Arthur was accepted as being an American citizen. He was always treated that way. He was probably born in Vermont. There's no proof that he was born in Canada. Sir?
Would the average American have understood these type of political cartoons at the time, or would you have to follow politics closely to get the point?
Yes and yes. And the difference is that...
Question.
Oh, I'm sorry. The question is, would the average American have understood these cartoons at the time, but they have understood all the allusions and all the references? Or would to understand them, would you have had to follow politics closely? And the answer is yes and yes. And what I mean by that is back then people followed politics way more closely than they do today. Back then, even though only a small minority could vote, women could not vote. In most places, African Americans could not vote. There were many limitations on who could vote. Still, there was no television, there was no radio, there were no movies. Organized sports was in its infancy. And so politics was very much the national soap opera. Every city had a dozen newspapers representing every side. Even if you couldn't read, you could follow the cartoons. Often a newspaper that took the side of one or the other would be brought into a saloon and someone would read it out loud, or at a large family, someone would read it out loud at the dinner table. So people followed politics much more closely than today. For instance, during this campaign, there was a rally held in New York City towards the end on the stalwart side for the Garfield ticket, where 300,000 people showed up for a political parade. When you think of it, the population of Manhattan Island at that time was about 900,000. That's how closely people followed politics. So when things like this came out, yes, most people did understand them. Way in the back corner.
Yes. Could you talk about the efforts to save the president, namely the involvement of Alexander Graham Bell?
Okay. Alexander Graham Bell did play a role in this, and as you know from the recent book by Candace Millard, Alexander Graham Bell was an inventor well known in Washington, D.C. at the time, and he had an idea for a metal detector. And it was well known in the newspapers that the doctors could not find a second bullet. And that was a major problem in their diagnosis and treatment. If they could find the bullet, then they could possibly take it out, but they couldn't find it, so they didn't know what to do. There were several scientific efforts made to help the president that summer. The United States Navy created the first working air conditioner to help Garfield in his room that summer, blowing air over ice with filters in order to bring cool air. But at any rate, Alexander Graham Bell created a prototype of a metal detector, and he was well known enough that he got permission to bring it in and try it out on the president. However, excuse me.
Mark Rubio.
Yes. I'll answer the rest of that in Spanish. When the doctors who were doing such a swell job up to this point forgot to point out that the bed had metal bed springs. As a result, the machine, while it was probably a perfectly good one and would have worked fine in optimal conditions, didn't work, and they never found the bullet. They found the bullet when they did the autopsy after the president died. Do we have more time?
One more question, yes.
Okay.
You say you're a historian of conventions.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, as a historian, that at that time, when the candidates were chosen by the convention, rather than the primary system, we got better or worse candidates?
Now that's a good question. The question was, back when presidential nominees were chosen by the conventions, who were generally populated, the delegates were people who knew the candidates personally. They were people who were political professionals. They were engaged in their craft. Did we get better presidents when the conventions chose the nominees, or when or today when the nominees are chosen through caucuses and primaries over a long period of time? It's a hard one because it's hard not to. It's for the answer not to sound like it reflects my political biases one way or another. But however, the campaign of 1860, the Chicago Convention of 1860. Conventional wisdom, had there been primaries that year, the nomination probably would have gone to William Seward. He was the better known candidate. He had the better national organization. He had more money behind him. Instead, the delegates met in Chicago. There was a lot of backroom dealing. It went on for 3 ballots. Seward led after the first 2 ballots, and the 3rd ballot was won by Abraham Lincoln. So arguably in that case, the convention, that more personal, intimate setting for choosing a candidate, gave us the better one. Similarly, Franklin Roosevelt was chosen on the 2nd or 3rd ballot, running against Al Smith. There are examples that went the other way. The last multi-ballot convention on the Democratic side brought us Adlai Stevenson. Many people still hold a candle for Adlai Stevenson, but he was a losing candidate. The last Republican chosen by a multi-ballot convention was Tom Dewey. Many people still hold a candle for Tom Dewey, but he was a losing candidate. The longest convention ever was 104 ballots in New York City in 1924. It produced James Cox. Anyone here remember James Cox? So it's a very mixed record. These are very human creations, human procedures. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. The convention was the most democratic, with a small d, system that anyone could come up with up to that time. Our year and a half of primaries and caucuses obviously has problems, obviously could be better, but it's the best that anyone's come up with up until this time, and I would bet my bottom dollar that next time it'll be different. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, for that terrific lecture. Very much appreciated. Chester Arthur did become president, of course, and he was even more reluctant than James Garfield to be president. There was a woman who wrote to him almost daily after the assassination attempt and encouraged him to be the man she thought and believed he could be, and he cried almost every night, reportedly, over this idea that he might become president, but he turned out to be a halfway decent president. So thank you for that terrific lecture. We're going to continue this series next week with a lecture on Grover Cleveland. I want to take a minute again, thank you all for being here. Thank those who joined us online from around the country, and thank our sponsors, Max and Victoria Dreyfus Foundation and the Palm Beach Post. Ken will be at the back of the room signing books and answering more questions, so you're welcome to join him there. Thank you again. Hope to see you soon.